Hi, I'm Molly from Wild Olive, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to add embroidery to your Enchanted Forest Quilt. The quilt is designed by Kristen of Woolly Petals, and I've designed these companion embroidery patterns for it. You can see there are little ornaments with cute little faces on it. There's some garlands. There's also strings of lights, gifts to add under the tree if you'd like, some candies, snowflakes, lots of little things that you can add on just to decorate your trees with a little bit of extra fun with embroidery. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how to do that, and you'll be able to decorate your own trees, mix and match all of the different pattern pieces, and make it exactly the way that you want. Let's get started. All right, let's talk about patterns. I have printed out a bunch of these, and I printed them on Sulky Stick and Stitch, which is a self-adhesive wash away stabilizer technically, but it is printable, and that means that you can get your patterns on here really quickly, cut them apart, stick them right down onto your fabric or your quilt blocks in this case, and then they dissolve in water, which is really helpful. It saves a ton of time, especially if you're working on dark fabrics. This is really easy to work with. So knowing that I'm going to make a bunch of embroidered quilt blocks, I printed the pages. There's different styles of pages in my pattern. I printed the pages where there's multiples on each page. I'm not sure if I'm going to use these candies on my main quilt, but I have this idea of making a candy quilt, maybe even just like a mini quilt with those. We'll see. I think they would pair really nicely with these little scallops. They would feel kind of candy-like. So I'm going to set those ones aside for now. My plan for my quilt is to use a bunch of these ornaments. So obviously I have a bunch of those. I may have to print more of these depending on how full I make my trees. I have some gifts to go underneath, snowflakes to put around the trees in like the background squares. They will all fit into those background squares easily, unless I change my mind and put some of the snowflakes on the trees. That could also happen. I've also printed out several sets of strings of lights, and a single page. This has enough to fill an entire tree. So you need print one of these for each tree that you are adding the lights to. There's a little bit of wasted material here. Just cut that away and save it, because you can reuse it in different ways. You can, trace extra patterns onto those scraps if you want. Okay, popcorn and cranberries. I'm going to do some of my trees with popcorn and cranberries. And I'm going to play around with it a little bit, and you'll see me playing around with it a little bit, but I may do some of my trees with only lights or garland, and some with only ornaments, because otherwise it might start to get very crowded. That could be the look that you want, especially if you only are going to have a couple embroidered trees. Then having them more full would be fine. But I'm going to play around with the spacing and everything, but my plan is to have some lights, some popcorn and cranberries. The garlands won't really fit if you do lights and a garland on the same tree. They're just not going to fit that way. So the next thing I need to do is cut these pieces apart. Okay, I have now cut out a bunch of pieces. So I have all of my lights here. I cut out 2 sets of ornaments, 2 of each ornament, and some gifts, because I think that's where I'm going to go with my first block. All right, so here is one of the tall trees. I can't quite fit it all on here at one time. You get the idea. And the strings of ornament, or the strings of lights, I should say, fit 2 per tree section. There is a little bit of flexibility in where they fall on the tree, but you want the ends of the strings to match up with the seams on the tree. If you want to change the placement of these, you can. You would just, you could either move them down a little bit and extend the lines. Here, just draw that out a little bit. If you wanted to bring it up, you would need to remove some lights if you wanted to bring this up closer to here, and just, figure out the best way to place those. I planned this out with these lights going very straight across the tree. However, Kristen from Woolly Petals, she's doing hers. She embroidered a set where they go like this. This is also super cute, and a lot of you often see trees that, especially like artistic illustrated trees, that the lights kind of zigzag back and forth. Neither is right or wrong. This uses up a little bit more space in the tree because of how it goes back and forth. And if you're only doing lights, that's probably a really good idea. If you want to put some ornaments in there, you can see how tight that is in between them anyway, but you could fit them. Put a star towards the top. Get a little mushroom in there. If the paper from the Sulky Stick and Stitch, if it overlaps, that's perfectly fine. You just don't want your pattern lines to overlap. Get a little bird here. One of these. This would start to, you can tell just from me putting a few of these on, this would get really crowded. There's room obviously for ornaments between the lights. But if I take out a string of lights on each one, then I might extend those lines a little bit. Then I could have ornaments and lights without any problem at all. Right? Then it works a little bit easier that way. Right? So you can play around with that. And if I take all of the lights out, then I've got room for a few more ornaments, right? That you can find an arrangement that you like. I might still print out, or cut out, I should say, maybe one more ornament for there so that it's a little bit more balanced. Then down below, there are 4 styles of presents. Up a little. And there's 2 wide presents. They will fit on the full squares in the quilts. Probably put them down, remember your seam allowance, but put them down, low enough. You don't want them floating under the tree, but you also don't want them to get lost in the seam allowance. So kind of in the low range. And then there's 2 taller trees. They will fit on the smaller blocks on either side of the tree trunk. So again, I don't know that I would fill underneath my tree, but maybe I would have like 1 or 2 trees that have a lot of gifts, and maybe some that don't have any. But here's an important thing to think about. We're going to talk about this on snow on my other block as well. I've chosen a solid fabric for my tree because it will give the most contrast for the embroidery. And that's really important so that those things show well. In the same way that we're going to talk about color in just a moment and contrast, solid fabric provides the most contrast for your embroidery so that it shows off really well. However, if you have fabrics that are very low volume or low contrast prints this is a pretty safe example. As long as I choose colors that contrast well with this, I could embroider over this. If I try to embroider a gift over these mugs, it's just not going to show up. You're going to see the fabric come through more. So choosing, if you're going to embroider around on patchwork, on print fabrics, that be very cautious in what you put where. All right, I'm going to just slide this over a little bit. Here's my short tree with darker fabric. This one, we're going to look at popcorn and cranberries. The short trees are a little bit different because there's not as much tree, so they don't need as much garland. The garlands are labeled A through F. If you're doing a short tree, you don't need B, although B and C are very similar, and you could swap them around if you needed to, if you wanted to. So some of the garlands don't go all the way to the edge of the tree. You could make them do that if you wanted to. It's just a matter of moving them up a little bit higher and then they will touch. But I'm going to leave these down a little bit. On my popcorn trees, I'm only going to have popcorn and cranberry garlands. I'm not going to put anything else on there. So you can see how those will look. Again, these could do this. Might do that. It's really cute. But it'll only have popcorn and cranberries. I'm not going to try and put any ornaments on those. Although I could. Popcorn and cranberries coordinate really well with the candy ornaments, the cookies, etc. But I might put a couple snowflakes on the edges. And here again, if I embroider these in white and I put this on, this is kind of a lower contrast print, my snowflake will still show up. I could do the same thing here. This is not a real busy print. This is very busy. Obviously those ones are, but the snow might not pop out quite as well on that, especially if I embroider in the creamy ecru. You'll lose it a little bit there. A print like this from a distance looks low volume, but when you start looking at embroidering over it, it's going to be tricky to work with. So look for things that are solids as much as possible or a really low contrast. Before I stick these down, let's talk more about the color though. When you're making your quilt, everybody's quilt is going to be a little bit different. So there's colors recommended in the pattern, sort of, but not specifically, because it's going to make a big difference in how your quilt looks. And we'll just start by talking about red. And if you have worked with fabrics, you'll know there's so many different ranges of red. Even within my own quilt blocks here, you can see the differences. This is a great example here. This is a much more orange kind of a red. And this is I would say more of a true red. Here is like a darker, more burgundy red. There's, a range. And the same is obviously going to be true for embroidery floss. And you need to just kind of make a decision based on what you think you like for matching up with things. Like, I probably won't try to match all of these because that would be too many reds in my embroidery. I'm going to pick one that I like the most. And this is like a little bit more of a cranberry red. And I'm probably going to put some popcorn and cranberries on mine. So that might be a good choice. But I don't love it with some of these other ones. It's okay there. I'm going to take that out. This is one of my favorites in a lot of cases, but it looks so light compared to these other true reds. So I'm going to take that one out. That's a little bit deeper. That works nice with the orangey red. I think it still looks good there. That's a contender. These true reds, for some reason, just don't speak to me. Okay, so I'm down to these two, a lighter one and a little bit darker one. And this is where it starts to get important. I'm going to talk about some other colors still to come, but I am going to actually pull some thread out from each of these skeins. And, if you're making decisions and you're, at a craft store looking at threads, you probably can't do this. But if you have a couple options that you really like, it's worth, pulling some out to consider them. These are laid across the, and I'm assuming that I'm only going to probably put red on the trees themselves, not on these backgrounds because they would get lost. Maybe at the base of the tree for a gift. But I want to see red and green are opposite each other on the color wheel. And so they technically have a contrast to each other, but sometimes they fight each other as a result of that. And you don't see the color stand out as much. So I'm just considering that when I'm looking at how these look on the greens and which one I think actually I like better. It's a tough call. I think I'm going to go with the darker one. I think that pops really nice on this darker green. I'm only doing 2 different colors of trees on my quilt. So I think I'm going to go with the darker red. So we'll set that one aside and I'm going to do this. So then other colors that you want to put into your quilt, base them off of the fabrics that you're using, but still look for that same contrast test. Make sure that it's going to stand out. I have 2 pinks that I think look really nice with the pink fabrics that I have around the edges. And you can see just from these, like the darker pink is a little less contrast than the lighter pink, but it's still going to stand out enough, even without pulling out a long strand to see. You can see that pretty well. We're going to stitch with all 6 strands, so that helps with making sure that the embroidery shows really well. Let's see here. I have a light blue. It's going to be used for the bird ornament and possibly some of the lights, I think. Yellow pops really nice on all of these. This is 743. It's one of my favorite yellows. Again, it's not in really any of these fabrics except for, let's see, here there's a little bit of a yellow and an orange, but that doesn't really matter. This, I wanted a yellow in here because of the star and a few other things. So I've got a yellow. I'm not sure if I'm going to put any gingerbread cookies on this particular quilt, but this is a nice, 436 is a nice gingerbread color. It also happens to match my tree trunk, so that would work out well. But, think about what color you want your gingerbread cookies to look. Okay. I might put in some silver for the ornament hangers. That's a nice one there. It's 03. Similar to reds, white is a thing. If you're going to do snowflakes, you might want them white. You could do them in light blue or a different shade as well. Here is a case where bright white there's a few spots of a brighter white in my fabrics, but most of them are a little bit more creamy. And I actually think that ecru is a better fit for this. So any spot that is white, I think I'm going to go with ecru. I might change it to something a little more creamy, but I'm following the fabric. That I think is the biggest thing here. Follow the fabric. All right. Last is some extra greens. I love a bright green. It's not neon, but it kind of has that feeling to it a little bit. And I think especially on a string of lights, this will look like it's lit up. The light is lit up. This is a much more yellow green, and all of my other greens are more blue greens, but I think that the contrast is enough to make it work. I was also considering this option. It's a lighter green, but it has more blue in it. It contrasts less with my lighter tree, more with my darker tree. I think I'm going to skip that one. I might keep it on hand. It could still, it still kind of all works with
the colors, when you start seeing them all together, that could still work in there. Maybe I won't ditch it just yet. And then when I go to do strings of lights, oh, by the way, popcorn and cranberries, I mentioned that before. So if I do my cranberries in this, my popcorn will end up in ecru, and that's a nice popcorn color, I think, too. So that I don't forget that. And, but my strings of lights, I think when you buy Christmas lights, a lot of times the cord is a really dark green, like to match your tree, blend in with your Christmas tree. So I think that's kind of what I want to do here, but I want them to be a little bit more visible. So on the lighter tree, both of these, you can see it, but without actually having it be a real strong contrast. And you could also do this in black if you wanted it to look almost a little more, I would say it looks a little more cartoony if you do that, but it has a stronger contrast. So I am still between those two colors, but you can see this one has a little more blue in it. This has a little more green in it. I'm not certain on that. Neither one of them have a strong contrast on the darker tree. So my plan is to not put any lights on my darker trees, because I'm not going to have all of my trees be embroidered the same. So I'm going to skip the lights on the darker tree and just use it on the lighter trees that I do. There will be some tall and some short in this lighter color. So I just have to decide which one I really like. And maybe it comes down then to playing with the entire palette once again. Do we like that in there? Kind of like that. Still works with that lighter one if I use it. That one also works. There's not a right or wrong with this, just like choosing fabrics for your quilt, there's not always a right or wrong. So go with your gut, but do look for contrast in your thread colors.
All right, I've made my final decision on this. I am going to do only ornaments on this tree, and I'm not going to put any presents under the tree because I am going to make sure that those go on to blocks. In fact, I'm going to, as I continue with making blocks, I'm going to make sure that I have a couple trees where I have better fabric choices underneath my Christmas trees. So yeah, I'm gonna plan for the embroidery, and that's a good idea for you as well to plan ahead on those things. But now this is the arrangement of ornaments that I'm gonna have on my tree, and so now we just peel the paper backing off, and stick it right on there like a sticker. You're gonna make sure that they are where you want them. You can reposition this material, but it will be less sticky when you do that, right? So try to decide before you stick, trying to get them down straight, etc. All right. Okay, so we have patterns on the tree, and we're going to put this into a hoop. For the ornaments themselves, you could use a small hoop like this. This is a 3-inch embroidery hoop. It is plenty big to hold an ornament at a time. And one of the benefits of that is that you're not going to overlap the embroidery with the hoop and press down on it. But there's some times when you might have to. So that fits into a small hoop. I have a lot of different sizes of embroidery hoops on hand because I embroider a lot. But if you don't have a lot of hoops and you don't want to buy a lot of hoops, then instead of a small one, I would recommend that you use something that is a medium size. I believe this is a 6-inch hoop. This will accommodate several pieces of embroidery within there at one time. Loosen it enough to go around, especially with the seams. There's a little bit more bulk around the edges, but that will hold. And you can work on several things at a time. That's a nice sort of all-around size hoop that you can use. When you start embroidering, especially if the hoop needs to overlap, like here you can see this wouldn't hold both of these totally in the hoop, so you would need to move this around a little bit, and occasionally you'll overlap a pattern. Just that's okay to have the finished embroidery or the pattern overlapped. Just don't leave it that way when you're not working on it. Take it out of the hoop in between stitching sessions. For my short tree with the popcorn and cranberries, once again, I do have snowflakes here, and they would fit in a small hoop like this. You want to make sure that you're not too close to the edge of your quilt block, because you'll pull at that fabric. It could fray a little bit. If you really wanted to be on the cautious side, you could run straight stitching very close to the edge to prevent fraying. But if you're careful, you'll be fine. So I could use a small one there. I could use a larger one. That's what you have. That's fine. You would overlap this a little bit. That's okay. Here again, you can see that a larger, or like a 6-inch hoop fits that quite well. But when you get down to longer strands of garland or lights, you will have to move this around. That's okay. You would put it in the hoop here, embroider what you can, move your hoop, embroider the rest. It might take 3 movements there. Oval hoops, that almost all fits in the oval hoop that way. It would still need to move, but sometimes this is a helpful size and shape to have, especially for longer pieces of embroidery. So that's something to consider. But if you're only going to get one hoop, I would get about a 6-inch hoop, 6 or 7 inches. That'll give you plenty of room to work. Again, just as you move your hoop around, be mindful of the edges so you don't cause extra fraying. All right, I have my quilt block in a hoop. It's fairly tight, but not too tight, because I don't want to stretch this to get it really tight. And before I start stitching, this is very important. For this, I'm going to be working with 2 different sizes of needles for all of the hand embroidery. In the cases where I'm using 6 strands of embroidery floss, I'm going to use this larger needle. It is called a chenille needle. It has a larger eye. It's a thicker needle, which helps to let the embroidery floss pull through without wearing at the floss, and it has a sharp point. This is different than a yarn needle that looks similar but has a rounded point. Tapestry needle is another one that is similar, but you want a sharp point, nice thick needle with a large eye. Then for the times that I'm using 3 strands, which is for the little faces, have 3 strands, and the hangers have 3 strands. In those cases, I'm using a regular embroidery needle that is like a medium size. Around a size 5 is probably what I go for, but I don't pay super close attention to that, as long as it's kind of an average size needle. You don't want it to be too thin. You ultimately don't want it to be as thick as this chenille needle, because you don't want to leave an unnecessarily large hole. So those are the 2 needles that you do want to have for your embroidery. The reason that I'm using 6 strands of embroidery floss for a lot of this is I want that bold contrast, like we've talked about with the color and fabric choices. And 3 strands, you won't see the stitching as much. If that's what you are looking for and you don't want it to be as visible, that's fine. You could use 3 strands. But if you want it to be nice and bold, because of the scale of this, I think 6 strands really helps it pop. Okay, so I'm just gonna thread my needle there. I'm going to start this with a knot, but the knot has a little bit of a tail, and my goal is to try and stitch over that tail. The knot will hold the stitching, stop it from coming undone, but it will also help to, the tail will make sure that the woven in tail, I should say, will help make sure that it does not come undone, especially if this quilt gets washed. Okay, so we're just gonna, I like using basic stitches because they look great, they are easy, and you don't have to think too hard about them. So outlines in back stitch, and it is as simple as coming up a little ways away from your stitching and then going back, or from your previous stitch I should say, and then going back down to fill in that gap. I mentioned that tail. So here is what's happening here, and it helps to pay attention as you go. This, you only really have to do this for the first few stitches. The tail is wanting to split here, which it will sometimes do. It's okay, we're just gonna secure the ends of those threads a little bit. This step is not absolutely vital. You could just tie a knot and it'll be fine. I have heard tales of knots coming unknotted in the laundry, but I've never had it happen. So I do this little extra step sort of out of an abundance of caution, because it would be really sad to make a quilt and have, it would be sad to make anything and have it come unraveled in the laundry. That's enough tail. It'll just be harder for it to come undone that way. That's the goal. Deter it from unraveling. Okay. Now I can just go about stitching this as usual. One more stitch on this. I will end off this thread. Just flip this over. You can see there's a lot going on the back, especially with 6 strands of thread. It's a little full back there. I'm going to tie a knot close to the back, and similar to how the tail was woven in when we started, I'm going to just weave this through the back of a few stitches to secure the tail. Trim that off. Set that aside. I'm going to stitch the face next. For the face and the little tiny details, we're going to use 3 strands, and I'm going to do black for the face. So I'm separating my embroidery floss into 3 strands. And for this, I'm going to use the smaller embroidery needle. There we go. Again, I'm going to tie a knot. This doesn't have a real long tail, but it does have a good strong knot with it. There's not as much to stitch the tail with. Stitch over the tail with. There we go. All right. So the faces are made up with French knots and scallop stitches. Some of them only have scallop stitches, and some have a scallop with kind of a variation on that. Scallop is a variation of a lazy daisy detached chain stitch. But I'm going to do a French knot here. I'm wrapping it 2 times, back down. Notice that I'm holding that working thread, holding it taut so that the knot stays well formed. Pull that down to tighten it. There's one little French knot eye. If you really dislike how this comes out, you can take out your face stitching because it's on its own. I'm going to do the mouth next with this little scallop stitch. And keep a loop on the front. Come up down here at the bottom of the smile. And if you pull this really tight, it will make kind of like a V shape, which is what you do on some of the eyes, like over here. But I don't want it to be too tight because I want it to be a little curved. So I'm just gonna loosen that thread a little bit. You go back down on the other side. That tacking stitch holds it in place. There's a cute little mouth. And we're gonna do another eye. There we go. So I'll just end that off with a knot and secure the tail through the back of some stitches. The tops of the hangers I'm going to also do with just 3 strands so that they aren't too heavy. Some of them it would work to do 6 strands like this, but on the little star especially, you would want to have fewer strands so that it's not as bulky. On the heart and the mushroom, those ones have French knots for the spots. On the mushroom, just take note where there's a face, you want to stitch the face in black and then the polka dots in their color for your mushroom. So I'm going to keep on stitching. I'm going to finish on this, stitch my popcorn and cranberries, and then eventually add on and do more of these blocks. But let me get through this first, and then we'll talk about what you need to do next to remove this paper.
All right, so I have some embroidered blocks here. I did these 2. And here is a bowl of water. This is kind of a, it's not quite room temperature, not quite cold water. It's somewhere in there. I don't want to, do anything to start shrinking my fabric or my embroidery, but I'm just gonna place this in here and let it soak. And obviously, I'm gonna go ahead and just submerge the entire quilt block. And with cool water, this takes a little bit longer to work. When it's warmer water, it works faster, but I'm going to err on the side of caution and do cool water for this right now. You can see, though, it's starting to shrink and pull away and dissolve a little bit, and all of that sulky stick and stitch will dissolve. It just takes a little bit of time. I'm going to take a risk. I think it'll be just fine, and I'm going to go ahead and save myself some time and put a second block in with this. So this is all going to hang out together because as it's soaking, it's not rinsing, it's soaking, and it'll just have some time to really get soaked inside of there. Then once the material has dissolved away, I usually will rinse it under a faucet just for a minute or 2, and that helps remove any last bits. With lighter colors, like the creamy colors, often the ink that is printed on the material, it will stay in the fibers, and a really strong blast of water under your faucet will usually take care of that. Of course, you want to make sure you also have color fast embroidery floss. DMC is usually pretty good about that, but if you ever have any of the reds bleed into your other into your fabrics or your other floss, a color grabber in the laundry usually takes care of it. I've had it happen before and the color grabber fixed it. So we're going to let this soak, and then I will show you when it is ready to come out. Okay, so I have drained the water out of this bowl, mostly. There's a little bit left. And next we're going to get these ready to dry. So what I like to do, I'll just move this out of the way a little bit, is I take whatever I've been soaking and I lay it on a nice fluffy towel. And since I have 2 of these blocks right now, I'm going to go ahead, fold a layer of towel over. Smooth this out as much as I can. Fold a layer of towel over it. And I'm going to take my other block, lay that out as well. And then I'm going to fold the towel back over it again. Then I'm just going to roll this up. And that's going to help press the fabric, press the water out of the fabric. So that's all rolled in there tight. Now, another way that you can do this if you really want to speed up squeezing fabric or squeezing water out of the fabric is you can lay this folded piece flat on the floor and you can walk across it. I would recommend doing it in bare feet. Socks might get a little bit damp. Don't want to do it in shoes. So put it on a hard, floor that would be safe to have it be wet, like a hard floor, not carpeting. And that will help squeeze extra moisture out. But it only has to stay in this for a short amount of time, and then you want to hang them up to dry, and then we will press them shortly. All right, so I have my block. It's been drying for a little bit, so it's just damp, and it's on the folded towel, the layered towel, but that's on my ironing mat. So I'm just going to go through and start to press this a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and keep my seams pressed open where they need to be pressed open and press to one side where they need to be to one side, following those recommendations in the pattern. And in the places where there's embroidery, I'm going ahead and pressing on the back of those. The embroidery part takes a little bit longer to dry. That's okay. Sometimes as you're pressing it, you'll see it really dry up still. Other times it just needs a little bit longer. But I'm trying to avoid ironing or pressing the embroidery on the front side. It will squish the stitches if you do that. It's not the end of the world, but I try to avoid it. The towel, using a fluffy bath towel, helps to prevent that from happening. So you can see here as it's ironing and drying at the same time. Again, just watching for those seams. You can see there's a few spots where I've had a little bit of fabric fraying, and I am just not going to worry about it. If there are places after you have been pressing this, when you flip this over, if there's places where it needs to be pressed or ironed on the front, that's fine. Just be careful around your embroidery if you want it to stay looking as nice as possible. Of course, once you wash this and dry it, you end up with a little bit of a different result anyway. It might fluff a little bit for you, but I generally, as a rule, try not to iron the front of my stitching. All right. Okay, this is pretty close. Let's flip it over and see. There we go. Gorgeous. So you can see my finished quilt blocks here. Everything's all nice and dry and pressed now, and they are ready to join together with themselves and then with other quilt blocks. And you can see here that I decided to add a face onto this tree. I'm probably not going to put it on both, but I decided that it would be really cute to add one of my style faces to this. The quilt pattern includes eyes and a mouth that you can do with quilt piecing, but I thought some embroidered facial features would also be fun. So in order to make these, I stitched the eyes with satin stitch and the mouth with back stitch. And on these, I decided, just like all of the other faces, I did those with just 3 strands. So you can do that too if you would like. But I hope that you've enjoyed watching these embroidery pieces come together, and that you give it a try for your quilt blocks as well. And if you need more help with embroidery, be sure to check out my channel for even more embroidery tutorial videos. There's things about splitting your threads and different kinds of stitches and so on. And you can always come to me with questions. I am happy to help you learn. And yeah, just enjoy making your Enchanted Forest quilt. Thanks so much for watching.